Hi, and hello, and welcome to our ArcGIS Cloud Migration and Strategy panel discussion. Today, I see some folks are still joining in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. This is recorded, and those of you that are joining in now and or as the meeting progresses, we'll be able to review this recording at a later date. My name is Steve Mulberry. I am a geospatial innovation strategist here at GIS Inc., and I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion. First off, a couple of housekeeping things here. This is a panel discussion, so we're hoping that you attendees will submit your questions. There should be a question tab there on the go-to toolbar that allow you to submit some questions. So please submit your questions to the panelists. Thank you all for joining us today. Also, we have a handout. If you look at the handout section in the toolbar there, we have a capabilities of managed cloud services, what we provide in that regards from a GIS perspective. So please help yourself to that handout. You can learn a little bit more about what we do at GIS and how we handle and manage cloud services for our customers. So with that, let's get started. I want to go around the horn here and introduce our panel to you. And we'll get started right away with some of these questions. So first off, let me introduce Zeb Stevie. Zeb, why don't you tell us a little bit about your role at GIS Inc. and I guess more importantly, the role that you played in the migration of the McCarran Airport.
You bet. Hello, everyone. I am Zeb Stevie. I'm a solutions engineer with our enterprise team. I work on a number of our cloud implementations. I am certified in AWS as a cloud practitioner, and I really work on a lot of different cloud providers. So I've implemented AWS as well as Azure with McCarran International Airport.
Excellent, thanks, Zeb. And we have Tony also from GIS Inc., Tony Urquidi. So why don't you introduce yourself and kind of tell us what you do at GIS Inc.
Hi, I'm Tony Urquidi, also a solutions engineer, but on the federal team. I worked with multiple clients to migrate them to the cloud. While I'm certified in Azure, I do both. I do work in both AWS and Azure.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony, for joining us today. And then last but not least, Melvin Serratos. He is a programmer analyst with McCarran International Airport. Melvin, why don't you take a little bit of time and introduce yourself, what you do at the airport there, how GIS actually plays a role within the airport system in Las Vegas.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. As Steve says, I'm Melvin Serratos. I'm a program analyst at McCarran Airport. I was more of like the technical lead for this cloud migration project here at McCarran. GIS's role in McCarran Airport is more to provide services that will help the operations and business workflows. McCarran has been using GIS since 1995. And over the years, we have collected enriched and comprehensive geospatial data that includes information about our assets and infrastructure. With this data, we provide services and products to support different business units and functions, such as safety and security, planning, design and construction, facility management, asset collection locations, and operations. We mainly provide services in two ways: custom maps and analysis tailored to specific business needs, and custom applications utilizing GIS layers in the forms of web, mobile, and desktop applications used by our staff at McCarran. Over the years, they have come to rely on our services to provide with the latest data and applications that have been an integral part of their day-to-day activities. So in order to support these increasing demands with GIS and advances of technology and like key integrations with other systems here at McCarran, like SAP, PropWorks, and Maximo, we decided to migrate to the cloud. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Excellent, thank you. So just a quick reminder, this is our panelists for today. If you have any questions, please submit them for our panelists in the questions section there. And I think we'll start off here, Melvin, and I do have a couple slides that I'm going to have ready for us, and just in case we have some topics here, I'm going to kind of keep this slide here that kind of introduces Zeb and Tony and Melvin, just so you guys know who you're talking with here. But let's start off talking briefly about the specifically the cloud migration project that you guys took on at McCarran Airport.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the cloud migration project came to fruition around June 2019, about a year and a half ago. We started with the proof of concept in April of 2019 by using Azure's Cloud Builder, but we're utilizing Azure's Visual Studio Enterprise subscription to play around with the idea. But it wasn't until June of 2019 where we had an initial meeting with GIS Inc. and our IT department to discuss details on migrating to the cloud. During this meeting, it was suggested to split this project into 3 main phases. Phase 1, we had design development environment, estimated to take 2 to 3 months. Phase 2 was production environment, 4 to 6 months. And phase 3 was sustainment and expansion, more so about take another year. So the core migration piece will last about 9 months max, and everything after is more of maintenance, expansion, and optimization. But it wasn't until September of 2019 where the project kicked off for our first phase 1, after all the contract and financial has been settled. It wasn't until then where we faced some difficulties. So originally the projected architecture was provided by GIS Inc. and we wanted to follow it. However, coordinating with our IT department, we had to modify some of the architectures to accommodate the network and security requirements that they had. And it was then where the timeline and planned tasks had to be skewed a little bit to accommodate these changes. So after some hurdles, we eventually finished phase 1 by June of 2020. Just a few months ago, and then we then aimed to production of our phase 2 go live on July 1st, and because of our fiscal year ending. And that 1 month gap between staging, dev and staging to production, this was feasible because dev and staging environments were completed, and it was easy to replicate similar configurations to production. But ever since we've migrated to production, to Azure for production, we've been in phase 2, phase 3, kind of. And by that, I mean, it was originally planned to move even our custom applications by the end of phase 2. However, due to constraints and code modifications, we decided to just move the ArcGIS enterprise software only by July 1st. So currently we're migrating custom applications to Azure, and as well as working enhancements and optimizations to the ArcGIS software.
Excellent, great overview. So it sounds like you've got the ArcGIS Enterprise in place now, and now you're starting to move into those custom application movement processes, correct?
Yeah.
So, and that's interesting because I heard you say a couple of things that kind of lead to our first question here, and that's sort of, and maybe we'll start with maybe Zeb and Tony helping kind of set the stage here on some of the challenges that we see in some of our clients pre-cloud. So some of the things that might challenge them on premise that kind of give them, this thought, hey, I want to move to the cloud because of A or because of B or because of whatever. So maybe Zeb and Tony, give us an idea of some of the challenge pre-cloud, and then maybe Melvin, specifically what some of the challenges you guys faced that kind of pushed this move to the cloud. Zeb, why don't you go first?
Yeah, you bet. So a lot of times our clients need the ability to get their GIS outside of their network. And, a lot of times there's, internal reasons or regulations that don't allow them, or they just don't have the infrastructure to set up that capability. So by going to the cloud, they're able to more easily get that environment public facing so that they can hit it from outside their network. And then really just infrastructure in general, a lot of times if they're not using some sort of VM type capability, procuring new hardware for environments, or getting OS upgrades it can just be it can just take too long to get that stuff in place. And if you go to the cloud, those kinds of problems are easily resolved by just spinning up new environments, instances, and things like that.
Yeah, we've seen other challenges that just a mandate comes in that requires that their GIS enterprise or their infrastructure be up in the cloud, and GIS managers just don't know how to get there, right? And what all is involved. So we're there to really assist them and letting them know what they need to do and how to implement and migrate everything over into the cloud.
Yeah, and I was just going to say a kind of a recent example is COVID. I mean, just the ability to easily access these environments out in the cloud is, I mean, people are really kind of realizing what the benefit is of having those things, just easily accessible.
Yeah, I was going to add that we've seen, especially this year, as crazy it's been, we've seen more and more people, like Tony mentioned, sort of thinking cloud first and wanting and having that mandate to move to the cloud, which is sparking a lot of these discussions, a lot of this demand. So from that, Melvin, what specifically did you guys face in challenges?
Sure. But I wanted to add another thing to you guys' comments before. But yeah, the main reason why we moved to the cloud was for ease of use, and we wanted the ability to have it public facing. Our previous environment was on premise, and it was kind of difficult to have things publicly available, especially when we're sharing with other county departments. And so moving to the cloud, making it public facing made it very easy to use. And in addition, we wanted more of like the hybrid like SaaS option. So like we wanted to decouple our work here at McCarran from like maintaining and handling patches of ArcGIS software to be able to use, but be able to use our own enterprise geodatabase and be able to connect to other systems at McCarran over a VPN tunnel. So we wanted more of like we wanted more of a way to like use the tool rather than someone maintaining it. And so I think in our current infrastructure in cloud, GIS Inc., you guys are managing our maintenance for the software and the OSs, so we don't have to really maintain that anymore. So we're just pretty much utilizing the cloud. But yeah, some of the challenges that we faced when migrating to the cloud was like infrastructure, kind of. There were some network and security requirements that weren't planned ahead of time. In our IT department, they wanted to use a very specific firewall, the Palo Alto firewall, in addition to the Azure infrastructure instances that we have. So that took a lot of requirements, and thankfully for Zeb and Andrew of the GIS Inc., they were able to provide all the security answers. They were able to answer all the answers for the security questions. But yeah, that was one challenge that we faced, and another one's kind of like a data migration, because since we're trying to have this like hybrid architecture, we wanted to have our data still here on premise more say, but how do we have the ability to have that data out in Azure? And so this whole idea of having to have a VPN tunnel where our on-premise database is synced to our Azure database. And we decided that way just because there was kind of a performance hit when we had to go over VPN when we do a data hit from the GIS software. So we wanted a way to like sync it, and that was one of the ways that we have it solved. So
excellent. And so we got a lot of questions coming in fast and furious, which is awesome. I just want to make sure everybody knows that if we do not get to your questions, we will answer every question. We will create a blog post on this. So please keep submitting questions. One came in here, Melvin, maybe you can answer this. Why did you guys choose Microsoft Azure?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. For us specifically, our IT department had an existing Azure tenant already. So instead of creating a new Azure tenant or maybe AWS, we might as well sync with our IT department. And so we decided to just go with Azure and use their Azure tenant. And more specifically, we had an Azure government cloud. We didn't opt for the Azure commercial, so we had Azure government.
Okay, very good, very good. So these cloud providers do offer like these bundles like GovCloud or these areas of infrastructure that can support the security levels that you guys needed. Interesting. So another question came in along those same lines, and maybe I'm going to pit Zeb and Tony against each other here because I know one's certified in Azure, one's certified in AWS. Is one better than the other, or how come Google's not in the discussion here? You know, maybe Zeb, start with Zeb. You know, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I would say almost all the cloud providers are similar. There are differences between them. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. It's more of an organizational component. Some are better for a particular organization. So, you know, if you are already a Microsoft shop and have certain types of licenses, you can easily migrate those kind of licenses to Azure, and it may have some cost benefit as opposed to going to AWS. And then, you know, depending on like your workflow, you know, AWS might have some services that are a little bit easier to implement. For example, Amazon Workspaces, it makes it pretty easy to migrate a desktop like ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Desktop solutions out to the cloud.
Yeah, going a bit deeper, we could also look at region availability. So where your customers are, we want to make sure that whatever cloud infrastructure we choose, that the users are going to be kind of have a fast connection to them. So we want to make sure that the region you're in is available in one or the other, and also the functionality within that region, because not everything is offered in the cloud providers. So there are some functions and roles that Azure may offer in region 1, but it's not offered in region 2. So we'd have to evaluate that. Like, what are you looking for, or what are you looking to do in the cloud? Making sure it's in the region that's available nearest to you. If not, then we have to expand that search and look elsewhere.
Perfect. So another question just popped in here real quick about the you know, which one to pick, Azure versus versus AWS versus Google. But is there a learning curve by using one or the other, or is deploying ArcGIS Enterprise pretty much the same across the board? What do you think?
Yeah, I can handle that. They both have a learning curve, right? So it's just depending on prior knowledge. When trying to implement GIS in the cloud, there's a lot of other kind of technologies you have to incorporate. So we're talking like network security, system administration. So all that you have to know beforehand before you try and implement in the cloud. But once you have that base knowledge, and once you learn kind of one infrastructure and how to implement it in one cloud provider, it's easy to translate that and then deploy in the other cloud provider. Really standing up the VMs and installing the software, it really is the same between the two or three, including Google.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get into more of the infrastructure. Some questions coming in around ArcGIS Enterprise as its components, right? And do you separate? Do you put these on one server? And specifically for you, Melvin, how many servers did it take to get ArcGIS Enterprise, or how many did you guys choose to use and leverage inside of Azure? So maybe Zeb, start off with, you know, which can we isolate all the components? Do we have to have everything on one machine? Talk about that, and then Melvin jump in there with you know, what it took for you guys to get running.
Yeah, so you can definitely put all the components on a single machine even. You know, that's not really the recommended approach. The recommended would be to have separate servers for each component to kind of isolate you know, the function of that component. So our server would have its own machine, portal, and so on and so forth, so that, you know, if there are issues with those individual components, you can easily you know, replace the server if you have to, but it kind of keeps you from having to, you know, replace an entire entire server, and you got to deal with every single component. So reliability is one thing. The other thing to think about is, if you have them all on one machine, you got to think about what your utilization is going to be, and what are your requirements for the GIS enterprise system. Are you going to have a very large box to run all of those components? And you also want to think about licensing, because of the way that the licenses work. You want to make sure that you have the licenses for the proper cores that you're going to be setting up. So that licensing would also kind of take a role in how you're going to implement the infrastructure.
Yeah, so just piggybacking on what Zeb was saying, I think we opted for having multiple servers separated, and this was recommended by Zeb and GIS Inc. But we had multiple different revisions on our architecture originally. Originally, we had about, I think, 5 servers, 5 or 6, and that's to accommodate. We had like the enterprise side of things, and we had a standalone. And the reason we had 2 different environments originally was because we wanted to accommodate our standalone infrastructure and replicate it as what we have here on premise. But as what Zeb was saying, we faced issues with licensing. So it was easier to just disregard the standalone in Azure, keep the on-premise standalones for now, and then we built the rest of the servers for the enterprise federation eventually. So we eventually get like 4 servers total. So we had the web adapter server, then that talks to both the federated ArcGIS server, which is federated to the portal server. And then we had, on top of that, we spun up an ArcGIS data store. So all of that, 4 servers are worked well together in federation. And that was suggested by GIS Inc.
Cool. So you ended up with 4 servers to make this initial deployment plan, right?
That's right. That's right. Oh, I forgot to say that we had this 4 servers, but we had 3 different environments. We had a dev environment, we had a staging environment, and a production environment. So all in all, it's 4 times 3, so 12 servers in total. So, and I think just recently we introduced a new server in our dev environment, which is the GeoVent server, because we're starting to tackle on that new concept of using a GeoVent server. So that's an additional server that we spent up just recently. Yeah.
So that's good, and it kind of leads into this next question about having a multiple deployment environment, a prod and a staging and a testing and a dev environment. Maybe Zeb or Tony, can you chime in here on is it okay to have all those deployment environments in the cloud, and is there any cost savings by how I manage those, when they're on, when they're off, and things like that? And do I have to mimic production the same way that I would do the other environments there? Maybe address that.
Yeah, I can take it a little bit here. So your dev and pre-production type environments wouldn't necessarily have to mimic your production environment exactly. Especially a dev environment. There are benefits to the cloud because you can turn off instances, and most of the models you kind of pay for the hour. So for those dev environments, when you're not using them, you can have them completely shut down, and you wouldn't be incurring those costs. And then for some of your if you have like a stage environment, you might want it to mimic your production as close to possible, but you would still be able to benefit from those cost-saving capabilities by turning it off when it's not needed.
Yeah, and that's usually what we see is that staging environment mimics prod. So the prod's a multi-machine site, then staging usually is. But we've implemented where dev is a single machine, all in one machine. So, and then we turn it off at night when it's not in use to save on costs.
Right. A huge benefit of a cloud environment is that you only pay for what you use when you need it and when it's on. So that's a big benefit. So we have some questions around migrating the enterprise geodatabase from on-premise to the cloud. And specifically, one of the questions were, what are some of the most common challenges that you've seen when transitioning from an on-prem enterprise geodatabase to a cloud enterprise geodatabase?
Yeah, so the really the main thing to think about when you're going to the cloud with the enterprise geodatabase is, how are your end users going to, access and interact with that database? So you really need to have a plan in place for where your desktop users are going to sit. So that's ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Desktop. You really want those clients to be on the same backbone as your database. So that's kind of step one. Really, if you're really going to go to the cloud, that's one thing you really need to make sure you account for. As far as migrating the data is concerned, it's not a lot different than migrating a database from your internal environments to another database instance. The key difference is you have to get it to the cloud first. So you have to get either a backup or some sort of data out there. There's plenty of tools that you can use to get that out there. AWS and Azure have actual services for pushing data, but you can also do manual, just putting it in S3 buckets or Azure Blob Storage or other, just putting those backups out there to get them restored in your database.
Yeah, I was going to say we'd also want to look at any third-party apps that may hit that database directly, because I know some third-party applications aren't kind of RESTful yet, or don't support a RESTful interface. So they require that direct database connection. So we have to identify those and make accommodations when we do migrate them to the cloud.
That's right. Yeah, I wanted to chime into the experiences, our experience here in McCarran. So yeah, we opted for like a database sync that happens. We decided to keep our on-premise database just because our data editors that use ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Desktop, they have really beefy workstations that they utilize even now. So to migrate that piece out into the cloud wasn't really beneficial and necessary for us here at McCarran. So we decided to just keep let them connect to the on-prem ArcGIS database, and then replicate the changes and sync the changes to Azure Geodatabase. But yeah.
So that's a good. Let's explore that a little more, because there's several questions here about taking where does desktop sit, when do we move it out to the cloud, and what's the best practice behind that? And I think what you just laid out there, Melvin, is one scenario, right? You can keep your desktop on-prem, keep your enterprise geodatabase, and then synchronize that with the cloud. So one of the questions here, did you keep the same database environment on-premise as you did in the cloud, or is there an option? And maybe Tony adds some comments to this after Melvin. If I'm using, say, Oracle or SQL Server on-premise, can I leverage some other database services in the cloud to help mitigate cost and or the synchronization process? So.
For us, the best option was to use the same technology. So we had SQL Server here on premise, and we just decided to have another Azure SQL Server just to keep the technologies the same. I think it was brought to our attention that we could use Postgres to help mitigate the costs, just because SQL Server is a little expensive, especially with the licensing and whatnot. But yeah, we decided to do that just to keep the infrastructure and technology the same. So.
Yeah, to add to that, yeah, you definitely can choose different technologies. So in Melvin's case, he could have stayed with SQL on-prem, and then we could have used the Postgres, which is open source up in the cloud, that works across Oracle too. So any kind of mix and match of relational database management systems, as long as we're using that Azure replication technology, it'll support the different database types.
So that was a follow-up question that someone asked too, was, so did you use, I guess, Melvin, in your case, did you use the built-in, ArcGIS replication and synchronization processes to keep the two databases in sync?
So I think it was a hybrid solution. So we had the syncing technology behind it was SQL Server, and I believe our DBA handled that piece. But we also, what we do here is we use ArcGIS's geoprocessing tools to help with the layer differentials. So here on premise before, we had geoprocessing tools that run, I think, every Tuesday, and that will modify the ArcGIS geodatabase. So what we did when moving to the cloud is we had the geoprocessing tool run for both the on-prem and the Azure SQL Server, because we faced issues with syncing all of the data. So we only had to use, the way we synced it was sync by geoprocessing tools, but anything that's happening on Azure or on-prem for other layers, only grab the deltas and certain pieces, because there was I believe there was a performance hit over the VPN tunnel that would happen. So we decided just to have only the important layers to be synced, and other layers could be just done through like the geoprocessing tools or something else.
And we've also done it where there's no direct connection between databases too. So we could sync to a file geodatabase, migrate that file geodatabase over, and then sync it back into the on-prem SQL or vice versa. So multiple ways we can implement that sync phase.
And I think, Melvin, what you mentioned there in your last sentence about having that virtual private network, or that VPN connection between the two environments, addresses this next question that came in, or at least we can talk about it. What other third-party business systems that you guys had to deal with that maybe helped you keep the decision of keeping the database on premise? And then I guess maybe to Zeb, can we have this hybrid approach where we have ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud, but still support on-premise other business systems with our GIS data? So maybe those two questions, Melvin and Zeb.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a situation that we have here at McCarran. We have other systems like SAP, PropWorks, Maximo, that need to integrate with our GIS layers. And so that was another key reason why we had geodatabase here on-prem still. Just like what Tony was saying, those systems don't really have a RESTful endpoint that we could consume outside in Azure just yet. So the way we've been integrating with them is through like database views and database chaining. So that's the reason why we kept the sync where we have Azure geodatabase up there and on-premise geodatabase here. And so, yeah, that's what happened for us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's kind of like the main point on those kinds of integrations. If your database is in the cloud, are those third-party systems going to be able to access it? Are they going to be able to just hit it over a RESTful interface, or do they actually need to connect directly to it? And that's where, I mean, you can still have your database out in the cloud as long as you have connectivity to your internal network through a VPN. You could still set up those integrations, but it's important to kind of understand what those requirements are and if the performance is going to meet those needs.
Okay, excellent. So initially, when you talked about migrating to the cloud, you guys picked up on Azure Government, the government cloud. Maybe Tony, can you, is there a comparison between just the off-the-shelf commercial Azure cloud versus the government cloud, and why one might choose one over the other? Is there anything that you can shed some light on with that?
I think it all boils down to policies and how certain policies are implemented. And then you also have who has access to that government cloud infrastructure from, say, Azure, AWS, the personnel who have access to it, and also who, because of the policies and compliance you have to meet, it all plays a role into who can access what. So a public cloud's more accessible to users, where the government cloud, if you need to interact with police or any HIPAA compliance, or I'm not even sure about HIPAA compliance, but say police, there's some policies in place, so you'd have to choose kind of that government cloud implementation.
Okay, and so do some of those policies and access come pre-configured with the GovCloud, or do you still have to have that administrative control over to deploy some of those?
Right, no, you still have to kind of deploy and administrate them yourself. So you have to implement that yourself through policies and procedures.
Okay, okay. So moving back to you, Melvin, in your space, there's some questions here dealing with IT support. Did they feel neglected? Did they jump on board with this? So maybe talk about how IT embraced this change or didn't embrace it. I don't know. Maybe you can kind of shed some light on that.
I think at first it was not really approved per se. There were challenges to get support from the IT department. But I think through explaining and figuring out what exactly the cloud provides for us, especially meeting our security needs, they were more willing to be more open about it. They're like, oh, okay, now I guess we could see the benefit of this. But yeah, it took a lot of meetings to help them understand the situation that we're in and why we're trying to use the cloud.
So a follow-up question to that someone asked was, did it increase or decrease the needed support from your IT group, or did it stay the same?
I think I would say the configurations was still needed for sure, but after that, it was more like just like maintenance. We could just say, hey, look at the current network setup in Azure, see if it's fine and whatnot. But they didn't really have to do the actual hardware support per se. Like for like the network team, they don't have to go in and monitor the switches or the servers per se. But they do have access. The way that our Azure Gov Cloud has separated is that we have the network team control the network's resources in Azure. We have the server team see their servers in Azure. And so they still have support in Azure still, so they had to still learn it. But it's not in a way where we have to deal with like more like the hardware side or like the maintenance of going down of when patches are needed. One that was all kind of automated already. So that piece is, I would say, the IT support kind of decreased, but their support in Azure is still there. Yeah.
Okay, so your IT department is going to, moving forward, they're going to be still the support mechanism for handling the infrastructure and the traditional support, correct?
More or less. I think for ours, specifically in GIS, we handed over to GIS Inc. They handle the ArcGIS software and the OS server patches. But it's more to say, because GIS software is not going to be the only thing that's in our Azure tenant space. They also have other resources that I'll be managing. So that's what I'm trying to say. In terms of ArcGIS software, that's done through GIS Inc. and they are the one handling it.
Okay.
But they have, yeah,
actually, because that's another follow-up question someone had is, is it possible to have a hybrid approach where you can have, someone like a GIS Inc. come in and manage some part of the environment and your IT manage some part and have administrators over some other part? So it sounds like that's totally doable, and we're doing it now with you guys. That's what it sounds like.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit. There's a lot of questions still around taking ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro to the cloud. So I want to focus on that just a little bit. And Zeb, I want to start off with you first, and tell me some of the options that we have specifically in Amazon Web Services for moving ArcGIS Desktop in the cloud. And then Tony, follow up with that with what's comparable inside of Azure for allowing me to run specifically ArcGIS Pro, right, with its heavy lift with 3D capabilities and image processing and those kinds of things. Maybe talk about that real quick.
Yeah, so you can definitely just do a normal EC2, basically a VM that you spin up to run those those types of software. So it could literally just be another VM like any other instance that you're spinning up. There's I kind of mentioned it earlier. There's a service called Amazon Workspaces, and that is essentially the end user would get their own desktop machine that lives in the cloud, and you know, they would be in control of that machine. They'd be able to do you know, all their desktop work on that machine. And then there's also a service called AWS Stream Services, which it would be similar to like a Citrix type environment where you're really giving access to the application. So end users would hit that stream and then be able to access ArcPro, ArcMap from that, and it's really just access to the application, not so much a machine, desktop machine.
Yeah, and it's similar in Azure, where you can have kind of that app streaming, but you'd have to kind of purchase Citrix to get it. So Citrix is supported in Azure. We don't have, as far as like Workspaces or the complement to Workspaces in AWS, it'd be more Windows virtual desktop infrastructure. You'd have a desktop you would actually kind of install the software on, and from there, you could then distribute that out to your users. It does require more administrative overhead, I think, than in AWS, but it does provide you the ability to kind of acquire a desktop with GPU, which is required for Pro. So, and then you could give it a full-blown 100% resources of that GPU, or you could even share that GPU with multiple users, so multiple users could connect to that one virtual desktop, and then they would share that GPU on that machine. And typically usage is just high or light Pro usage. If you're going to do any image analysis, you'd want 100% of that GPU available to you.
Okay, and so with those options available, and so if someone chooses to take desktop, move it to the cloud, and now I need to have my enterprise geodatabase. I know, Melvin, you talked about having sort of this hybrid approach where you have it on-prem in the cloud, you do the synchronization. A question came in about, can we leverage the services provided by one of these cloud providers, like their relational database services, or do we have to stand up a specific virtual environment and install the software like SQL Server or Oracle or Postgres? And then specifically, what did you guys do to support your enterprise geodatabase in the cloud?
Yeah, so originally we tried utilizing our Azure SQL Server as a service. I think we didn't opt out for that just because there were a few administrative tools that weren't accessible with that service. It could have changed by now, but I believe our DBA said, oh, they couldn't do some of the toolings that they were used to as having to have an actual SQL Server machine. And so we decided they spin up their own VM and they spin up a SQL Server installed on top of that. But as far as like virtual desktop, as I mentioned before, we didn't opt out that way just because we already have beefy workstations here on prem, and so we didn't want to waste that resource. So we decided to have that hybrid approach.
Yeah.
So is it supported though? Is it supported? Can ArcGIS Enterprise run on these services out there?
Oh yeah. You definitely can have enterprise geodatabases in like RDS or the Azure databases, those databases as a service. So you definitely can use those services for the enterprise geodatabases, and you know, basically any supported database on the Azure side. So you know, Oracle, SQL Server, Postgres, for example, like those databases as a service would be capable of running an enterprise geodatabase. And I think you kind of mentioned you definitely want that data to be with your ArcGIS server that's serving the data. So similar concept to the desktop side. You wouldn't want your enterprise geodatabase going through like a VPN back to your internal database.
Yeah.
You definitely want, you know, either that data replicated out some fashion or actually live out there with your ArcGIS server.
Okay, and that makes sense. This next question is probably specifically for GIS Inc. here. So Zeb or Tony, maybe Tony can start off with it. But some of the maintenance routines, so things like you might have to do weekly or monthly or yearly. What are some of the things that we would do as a managed service provider for someone that we would do on a regular basis, just to kind of make sure the system's running healthy, it's clean, and it's performant?
Right. So on initial setup, we'd actually set up logging and backups. So like monthly or weekly, we would validate that, hey, review the logs, make sure everything's running right. If any errors, we'd identify those, let the client know, and then proceed to resolve them. Making sure the backups are running as often as we had set them up in the beginning. And then more monthly, it'd be patches, identify what patches need to be implemented. Not every patch needs to be installed. There are patches specific for like Oracle or one database versus another, one application versus another. So just install what's required. And just continuing maintaining that environment, that infrastructure, making sure that we're not exceeding the capacity of the instances that we determined at the beginning you needed. So that's an ongoing kind of thing that we'll be looking at.
Yep. Yeah, just to add on there, we'd also be kind of monitoring, utilization, CPU, RAM, disk space, those kinds of things, just to, keep the overall health of the environment in check.
So perfect segue. I don't know if you've seen the questions here, Zeb, but the question is about monitoring. What tools do you use to monitor ArcGIS Enterprise and it's kind of keep the eye on the ball, right, to make sure things are running proficiently, and maybe lean into what you guys did for McCarran, or Melvin, maybe you can add how are you guys monitoring your environment?
Yeah, so I mean, we've kind of run the gamut on monitoring solutions. So we've kind of implemented our own Python scripts that kind of keep that RAM, CPU, disk space kind of monitoring, and then we actually used dashboards in the enterprise to kind of visualize those metrics that we're collecting. We've helped clients set up the actual monitoring solution that's provided by Esri, and that one is great because it's geared towards monitoring the actual enterprise. So you get a little more in-depth monitoring for services and some of the specific Esri components. And then we've recently started using a monitoring software called PRTG is sort of a low-cost monitoring solution. It's very has a lot of tools and connectors that you can use, but it has some free use to it.
Here at McCarran, we kind of just let GIS Inc. handle the monitoring and logging piece of things. So that's kind of like off our hands. But I do know that they set up couple of, was it Azure Vaults? Correct me if I'm wrong, Zeb, but I think it was Azure Vaults that set up the backups and the logging that they will provide. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point there. There's also tools within the cloud providers that can monitor your environments as well. So you can get a lot of that information out of those tools.
So this whole discussion, and rightly so, we're having a lot of questions still around desktop, and I don't want to belabor this topic too much, but this is very important on where we put desktop. And we heard from you, Melvin, about how your situation is set up. Did you have to put a desktop license out there for any kind of management or administration purpose?
Yeah, actually, we've had to install ArcGIS desktop, ArcMap specifically, or is it ArcMap? All desktop up into one of our servers, our ArcGIS server specifically, just because we have had to publish services, and there wasn't really the way that our infrastructure was set up. There wasn't a way where our on-premise workstations can connect straight via backbone to the ArcGIS server itself to publish. So we had to install the ArcGIS desktop on the server, and then someone goes and RDPs into the server. They transfer over the MXD file or whatever they have to do, and then publish via the ArcMap. So
excellent. Okay. And so I want to kind of revisit this real quick because I know we've been talking about it a lot, but there's still some more questions around desktop. But Zeb, when you mentioned having and using Amazon Web Services a workspace to use and to install ArcGIS Desktop on it, does that mean, one of the questions came here, does that mean we can use just a lightweight laptop, like a Chromebook or something, just access it via a thin client or a web browser? Is that possible?
Yes, exactly. You just need basically access to the internet. You would install a tool potentially for the workspace. It's almost like a RDP, but it's specific for the workspaces. But the machine that you're running doesn't have to be a high powered machine at all. So, and there's also technically there's a web console, so you can technically, as long as you have a browser, you could connect to those instances as well.
Right, and Tony, I would imagine too, though, that even if you use the virtual desktop environment and create a VM and you can still use a lightweight RDP app, right, remote desktop from your local machine into the cloud provider and execute whatever desktop tools you needed to access, correct?
Yeah, definitely. All the heavy lifting, the processing, it's being done on that remote desktop. Your client is really just accepts the keyboard entries and mouse entries, but it's all done on the actual virtualized desktop in the cloud.
Okay. We're getting a little bit close to the end of time here. I'm going to grab a couple more questions here. One of them, Melvin, directed to you. So, knowing what you know now, what would you do different? Was there anything that you said, dang, I wish we'd done this differently, or was it growing pains, or what did you lessons learned from that?
lessons learned. I would say definitely make sure you've definitely planned out the infrastructure side accordingly. I think for us that was kind of like the really big headache, just to coordinate all of the security compliances and requirements that we have. And honestly, maybe not to have it as like robust as we have it, just because there is a performance hit that can happen if you introduce, like, for us, the firewall is in between every single traffic between the servers. It's not just like the internet firewall then to the web adapter, and then the web adapter just talks straight to the server or the geodatabase or whatever. Our firewall specifically is internet, web adapter, then go back to the firewall, then to the server, then back to the firewall, then back to the geodatabase. So something like that is, I would say, a little extreme, but
yeah, and in that particular scenario, kind of makes it hard to troubleshoot.
Yeah.
Speed issues and things like that, because there's so many hops going on.
Definitely, yeah. And that was one of the issues that we had, because we tried to do a comparison between the on-premise layers, like we would go to the view map viewer and try to estimate the seconds that had been elapsed between the rendering between the on-prem versus the one in Azure, and we saw there was like probably a 1 or 2 second delay. But for us, technically, it's not too slow, but for like the end users, you could visually see, oh, there's a 1-2 second delay, and it seems kind of slow. But yeah.
So that's interesting, because that's a follow-up question here. Did you experience any kind of latency or degradation in services that you didn't have by having it on-premise when you moved to the cloud? It sounds like you had a little with the map viewer, or can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So when we publish our services to ArcGIS server, usually there's like a tool or so you can just have like click on map viewer, and then it'll like kind of display the map that you've and the layers that were attached to that map. And what we've seen was just that on-prem was a little bit faster, but I think it's due to the firewall hops, and there's so many of it. And versus our on-prem setup, we only had 1 server versus having 4 servers now in Azure. So there was kind of a switch, but I think it was all expected per se because of the security compliance that we had in Azure. So.
Excellent. Okay. We got about 5 minutes left. We have some more architecture type of questions. Zeb and Tony, I got a simple slide here that I want to bring up, and maybe Zeb, you can talk to it about a sort of a traditional sort of implementation about how we might go about deploying just the base components of ArcGIS Enterprise. Can you sort of talk to this real quick?
Yeah, for sure. So this kind of scenario here is very typical. You have your network, so that's basically that VPC set up in an AWS cloud, and then inside that network, this is kind of showing you that you would have kind of a segmented network on the subnet level, where you have public facing pieces and pieces that aren't public facing at all. And what that allows you to do is spin up all those components of ArcGIS Enterprise in that private subnet, so that they literally just, there is no access to them from the outside. They are completely locked down from the outside world. And then using network rules, you can you basically just have holes in the two subnets that allow the web adapter to talk to those internal facing, those internal only servers. And then that web adapter would be it's really just either an IIS box, or you could use Apache as well as your kind of your front end server for your REST services and for access to portal. I will say that you could even bypass the web adapter altogether and use something like load balancers to give access to those internal infrastructure, or on the Azure side, it would be like application gateway. They also have load balancers on that side, but the application gateway is typically the way you would, it'd be like your front end to those components on the back end.
Great. Perfect. So Tony, just real quick then, to kind of close up this panel discussion, is according to this diagram, is it we're showing an Amazon Web Services sort of approach, but I'm guessing it's something similar to Azure here with its components.
Yeah, very similar. Just the names would be different. We didn't implement the same thing in Azure. It's just different names. So VPC would be a VNet. The elastic load balancer would we could replace that with just Azure's equivalent. So very similar. Exactly the same, just different terms.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, this architecture design is almost exactly to what we have, except we just have a firewall in between each server. So, and we done in Azure. So, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we are coming up to the end of the discussion here. I want to thank all of you for joining us out there in this webinar. Tony, thank you so much. Zeb, thank you for joining, and obviously Melvin from McCarran Airport, thank you for sharing your knowledge, your challenges, the things you worked over, all your experiences. I think it's going to help a lot of people out as they start to think about moving to the cloud. So again, thank you all for joining. And those of you that are still on, please hang tight. As soon as we close this out, there'll be a short little survey that we'd like you to take. And everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.